Hegel, we have that wonderful quote that all of philosophy is a footnote to Plato, but all of contemporary philosophy is a reaction to Hegel. How is John Stuart Mill a reaction to Hegel? And why is utility a reaction to Hegel? Well, the writings of all of these folks are just full of this idea of a social dialectic that gives us our sense of reality. As I suggested, using Peter Berger's text, the social construction of reality, I think is a common expression that we use today. And they're definitely accepting this. And I also mentioned while talking about the phenomenology that what you get out of this dialectical process, which simplified is just the thesis, automatically pulls its antithesis, and then between the conflict between the two of them, you get a new synthesis, which is now the new thesis, the new current situation, and then it just keeps on going, right? So this is actually as old as Heraclitus. But it's the new movement following Hegel. By the way, it's also an organic movement. I mentioned that with regard to Schelling. And remember, this is really a whole generation of folks that are developing this. Hegel's just kind of a flag leader or flag waver for the movement. And so it's a change from the mechanistic universe that we got with Descartes, which was an advance at the time. Remember, if you remember Sophie Hoffman or Sonia Hoffman in the movie Mind Walk, Descartes was wonderful, she says, for the time, because that developed this scientific way of thinking and so on. But we've gone beyond that now, as she says, and now they're into an organic model, which Hegel refers to as the oak tree. As you're describing an oak tree, at what point does the oak tree become an oak tree? Is it when it's an acorn? No, we all agree it's not an acorn. But an acorn then has a sprout, and you have the beginnings of an oak tree. Is it an oak tree yet? A little harder question. It's a sapling, or whatever we now call a 6-foot thing that you can move and bury or whatever. You go into it, how you do the root ball, etc. And you got an oak tree, and they did plant them all over the place. Hegel and his friends planted an oak tree. I forget which city. It might have been Stuttgart, but it might have been Tübingen, I think. In any case, they planted a tree because that was, actually a model of the revolution. Was that it's not a mechanical universe. It's an organic universe. It's like nature growing, and that's much more complex because as the tree goes through this process, this dialectical growth process, it's also involved in its environment. There's other things that we know, for example, today are important for the health of the tree. There's all kinds of fungi and things that are on the roots that help feed the tree, and the tree feeds them. It's a symbiotic relationship, right? And then there's that connection with other trees. If there's a mother tree I mentioned, right, that interconnects with other folks. And as the tree grows, it's an environment for the birds and for all kinds of other creatures that use this tree. The acorns, of course, that flourish off of it, and so on. Remember George Washington helping to feed the men at Valley Forge using acorns. It sounded like a horrible way to try to live. Valley Forge, it's a park now. I was there in 1976 when Gerald Ford, who was president at the time, gave a speech. And by the way, there were wagons, Conestoga-type wagons from all over the place, including Alaska, which nobody used a Conestoga wagon to get to Alaska. But by the way, it's actually in Eagle River in a little barn with a grass roof and windows so that you could look in and see that wagon. It's there right by the VFW in the parking lot of the VFW. But so it's organic, and organic is much more complex. Of course, we're learning more about that today than Hegel could have known, but nonetheless, the model is much more difficult because you can't really, in a black and white way, say at what point is an oak tree an oak tree. You know, what about when it falls down? It's dead now, and yet it's still an oak tree, and yet it's still an environment, in fact, an even richer environment for a lot of organisms to feed off of that tree, and so on. So all of this is much more complex, but also evolutionary. And so when you think about how that mindset impacts Europe in general, it's going to change a lot of things. It's, as Thomas Kuhn described it, a paradigm shift. I don't remember if I brought up Thomas Kuhn at all. I don't think you did. Thomas Kuhn, the work that he's most famous for, and it surprised the heck out of everybody, because who the heck buys a book that's the structure of scientific revolutions, but it became like a bestseller at the time. And what it's all about is the idea that science itself is not a clear-cut advance, but instead is really modeled on sociological change, the way humans do things. I mean, after all, scientists are human, and what seems to happen is that humans tend to glom onto a particular theory, and everybody believes it, and if you want to advance in that academic structure or whatever, you have to accept the current status quo ideas on what's going on. But as a matter of fact, the people that are doing the studies will discover that there are problems in that. Remember Einstein saying that you can't solve a problem by thinking about it the same way that caused the problem, you know, et cetera, something like that. But you get young people, usually, that are not part of the status quo. So they're not the ones that the fathers are already teaching and making sure their sons get their job, but they're the smarter ones, actually. And they're frustrated because they can't get those jobs, but at the same time, they're the ones that start thinking outside of the current status quo box, so to speak, and they come up with new theories to explain what's going on, and then they literally have to have a revolution where they end up taking over the status quo and replace the old status quo's theory with the new theory, and you have a paradigm shift. So it's actually more like humans changing things than some kind of automatic, this theory developed and became this theory and this, etc. You know, it's not that kind of clear thing. It's much more a human kind of, structure that changes these scientific revolutions. And they're not really logically following one another. So, I mean, Sir Isaac Newton's theory doesn't logically lead to Einstein and relativity. Right? Actually, it's even more complex than that, because remember, Berkeley and Leibniz were both into relativity at that time, and there was a conflict with Sir Isaac Newton, who was steady state universe instead. Euclidean geometry, you could draw a line, through the universe, etc. But the revolutionary way of looking at it really was a relative way. It's dependent on your perspective, etc. Right? So these scientific revolutions that give us a paradigm shift are an example of what happens at that time when Hegel and his contemporaries shift the paradigm from a mechanical universe to an organic universe, which, by the way, is still our current theme. When I think of a perfect example of that. Doug, I think you were the one that asked, and I suggested, how about Bruno Latour? And I specifically even loved his Kyoto Prize. And I'm going to go right to his instead of, I got to do a commercial thing, I guess.
Kyoto Prize was
okay.
founded by Kazuo Nomura in Japan as a prize that would celebrate some of the best achievements in science, in the arts, in philosophy, and
in terms of the virus. I mean, this is an absolutely normal way in which they spread through the net. And we learn every day that this country is available, but not that country, etc. So the whole connectedness of human relation was modified by the insertion of the virus's own way of connecting people globally. So it has a different view of the global, its own way of globalizing. It has a different view of mutating, and it has a different view of modifying every other entity, including human bacteria, of course, inside which it inserts itself. And that's very interesting, and of course for me especially, because I've studied Louis Pasteur, the great French bacteriologist, for many years ago. And of course it's what I've studied in Pasteur's case, that is how microbes inserted into society in the 19th century had deeply modified what we could call the social order at the time. And we relearned that with the AIDS, of course, tragic story, we're still learning it, and with every epidemic. But we relearn it globally with the COVID, and that's what interests me. So I want to use a virality with as a guide, as a sort of a token, a mascot, because every cosmology has its own privileged object, if I can say that. And I want to contrast what was the privileged object before and what is now the privileged object, which I will argue is something like the virus type of virality, actually in English also vitality, which is so typical.
So this is the lecture he gave from his living room in Paris for the Kyoto Prize, which is you could look and see who the Kyoto Prize winners are. Willard Van Orman Quine was one. Martha Nussbaum was a recent one, by the way. And no one usually that I mention this to is familiar with the Kyoto Prize, which is, so don't feel surprised if you don't. But notice this was his Edinburgh
Five words
lecture.
you pronounced wrong 2 years before your brain starts shutting down. Dementia is now known as type 3.
Why do you sound like Jordan Peterson?
That one was Jordan Peterson. Sorry about that.
Yeah, it definitely sounds like
Because this difference is actually not that big. There is one really big feature, which is the one that organizes this direction. And here we forget about the fact that it's different when it's more an economy. You see anything? Yeah, it's nice. Now, we need to name those two attractors. One attractors, I would...
So I'll just briefly, you could look this up, obviously, and it's on there. This is the Edinburgh lecture that he gave when he won, well, I don't know if it's considered a prize, but whoever gets selected to give the Edinburgh lectures each year is that same kind of thing. Notice the topic here, why Gaia is not the globe. And what he's trying to do in this series of lectures is convince people that we have to change the model that we're using to think of the Earth from a full Earth to instead focus on what he's calling Gaia, which you've heard that before for nature, right? And Gaia, he says, is really just that very thin envelope around the Earth. That's what we have to really worry about, because we don't live in this big, full, huge globe. We live in that very thin envelope around. That's where all life is, in that area, right? And so the kind of globalization and the change in weather and all that stuff that we're causing, he thinks